We will now take a brief look at some basic concepts related to evolution by natural selection. Let's begin by discussing what exactly do we mean by evolution. Well, there are several ways in which we could think about evolution, but let's just define evolution as a genetically based change in the characteristics of populations over time. Another way of thinking about this is a change in allele frequencies over time. And future chapters, future videos, will explore some of the specific ways in which evolution can actually take place. This chapter, of course, we're just focusing on natural selection. First of all, let's discuss some misconceptions that many people have about evolution. First of all, evolution is just a theory. Therefore, the evidence for evolution is not very strong. Well, that would be a false statement. In science, when we talk about theories, we're talking about ideas that have lots of strong supporting evidence. If we were to say a bird can evolve larger wings to fly faster, well, that too would be a false statement. The idea here is that evolution occurs at the population level. Individual organisms are not able to evolve. Humans are more highly evolved than worms. Well, that's really a false way of thinking about evolution. Yes, humans may perhaps be more complex and have larger brains and mental capacity and so forth, but both humans and worms and other organisms for that matter have lots of complex adaptations that allow them to survive quite well in their particular environments. Humans evolved from chimps. That too would be a false way of thinking about evolution. It turns out that there's lots of good evidence that chimpanzees represent humans' closest living relatives, but that does not imply that humans evolved from chimps. So that's an incorrect way of viewing evolution. So, again, those were just to point out a few misconceptions that some people have about evolution. So very briefly, let's talk about early evolutionary theory. When you think about evolution, you probably think about Darwin, and fair enough, he made lots of valuable contributions to our understanding of evolution. But even before him, there were people who were thinking and proposing ideas about evolution. So one of the ways that people used to think about evolution was sort of like a ladder. Some of the lower organisms, you might think of bacteria and fungi and so forth, evolved into higher and higher, more and more complex organisms, leading ultimately to human beings. So this sort of ladder-like progressive approach to viewing evolution, again, this was the ideas years and years and years ago, but this is not really how we think about evolution anymore. Also want to point out Lamarck, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He made some valuable contributions to our understanding of evolution as well. Some of his ideas we don't really adhere to anymore, but nevertheless they were proposed and really got people thinking about evolution. So one of the ideas that he focused on was this idea of inheritance of acquired characteristics. So the basic idea is if an organism uses something, imagine giraffes, for example, stretching their necks up as high as they can to reach the tops of trees to chew the leaves as a source of food. Well, if they stretch their necks, and if they can somehow make their necks longer, they could then pass that on to their descendants, right, to their offspring. So this idea of acquired characteristics. Again, we no longer really view this as a correct way of viewing evolution because it turns out that evolution relies on genetically based characteristics, not necessarily acquired characteristics. Another person, of course, we'll mention, Charles Darwin. I won't say much about Darwin here. There's obviously an awful lot we know about Darwin and the history of him and how he became poised to radically change the way that people think about life and evolution. So one of the things I'll just briefly point out here is that there are a variety of things that inspired Darwin's thinking. He was reading essays on overpopulation and thinking about artificial selection and so forth. But one of the things he noticed when he was on the HMS Beagle, making his way around the Galapagos Islands, is that when he looked at mockingbirds, he noticed that there were, when he collected and looked at mockingbirds from these different islands, they tended to be slightly different, yet very, very similar. It turns out that the mockingbirds were actually different species living on these different islands. So he sort of contemplated this and wondered, well, how can we explain that? How does that make sense? Why are we going to have these these species of mockingbirds that are so similar yet subtly different on these different but closely located islands. And he essentially started thinking about explaining this in terms of if they all originated from some common ancestor that made its way to these islands, and then over time the mockingbirds living on these different islands were under different selective pressures and so forth, and they evolved into the different species that we now see today. So he got us thinking in terms of this descent from common ancestors. Okay, a different way of thinking about things than the evolutionary ladder that we saw previously. So if we think about, we can stick with our example of the mockingbirds here. If we think about the relationship between different lineages or different groups of organisms, what we're looking at here is a phylogeny. Phylogeny is just sort of a hypothetical proposed relationship among different species or among different lineages. So what we see here is this idea that some common ancestor gave rise to these 4 different species of mockingbirds that Darwin was observing. I just want to point out briefly that when we think about phylogenetic trees like we see here, what evolutionary biologists try to focus on are monophyletic groups. So monophyletic groups include only the descendants of a common ancestor and all of the descendants of a common ancestor. So for example, you might say in this image here, if we include all 4 species of these mockingbirds, that represents one large monophyletic group. We could also say that each species represents a separate monophyletic group, again because each includes all and only the descendants of some ancestor. We could also say the group consisting of the green and the red lineages, right, those 2 species there, they too, that represents a separate monophyletic group. So again, this idea of monophyletic groups, that's what evolutionary biologists try to identify and focus on. If we think about, let's go back here just for a second. If you think about the phylogeny that we see here, you can imagine all sorts of traits in these different species, different lineages here. And some of those traits perhaps evolved one time in some common ancestor, while other traits might have evolved separately in different lineages. So the next concept I want to point out is this idea of homology or homologous structures. Homology refers to anything that is found within some monophyletic group that was inherited from a common ancestor. So for example, many textbooks distinguish different types of homologies, although they're not really mutually exclusive. On one hand, we can talk about structural homologies. For example, think about birds. Well, all birds, pretty much all birds, have feathers. Feathers in birds probably evolved once and are now found in all groups of birds. So we say birds have feathers that are homologous. So feathers are homologous structures. What we see here are various bones found in different species. These bones are so similar in terms of their structure, their development, and so forth, we say they likely represent homologous structures, right? It makes sense that these bones were evolved. They evolved once in a common ancestor and then simply diverged over time in these different lineages of organisms. We can also talk about developmental homologies. The labeling in some of these images are unfortunate. This is not to imply that humans have gills and cats have gills. Nevertheless, what this is trying to show that developmental patterns are so similar among different groups of organisms that a lot of these developmental patterns probably are homologous, right? Inherited from some common ancestor. We can go one step farther and talk about genetic homologies. So here we see the sequence of amino acids found when 2 genes are expressed involved in the development of eyes in humans and in fruit flies. The genes and amino acids produced from these genes are so similar. They're just a few amino acids that are different, right? So humans and fruit flies, 2 radically different groups of organisms, yet we have essentially some of the same genes involved in eye development. So again, keep in mind that these examples of homologous structures and development in genetics, they are not necessarily mutually exclusive, okay? Because of course, genetics, that determines development, and of course, ultimately that determines structure itself. Okay. Although many structures are homologous that are found in different lineages of organisms, other structures aren't necessarily so. So for example, if in this image you see two organisms pictured, a dolphin and an ichthyosaur, they look very, very similar. So just superficially, you might say, well, they have the same body plan. You might say that overall body shape and form, that might represent an example of homology. But if you look at the phylogenetic tree, at least based on best available evidence, you see that it's possible that that body plan evolved once in some common ancestor, but then it would have had to have been lost in all of these lineages except for whales and ichthyosaurs. Not very likely. A more likely explanation is, well, that body plan evolved separately and independently in these two lineages, again, in whales and in the ichthyosaurs. So in those instances, we say, here we have something, some trait, some physical feature, looks almost the same in these two different groups of organisms, but probably not homologous. Instead, we describe these as being analogous structures, or we also refer to this as convergent evolution. So as another more extreme example, birds have wings, insects have wings. Right? They're both wings. They both essentially do the same thing, but they're probably there as a result of separate and independent origins of wings. Right? You probably wouldn't mistake insect wings and bird wings as being homologous. Right? So again, we'd say those are examples of convergent evolution. So what are some of the examples of evidence of evolution by natural selection, evidence that species and populations have changed over time? You can imagine quite a few examples on your own, I'm sure, but just a few examples listed by many textbooks. First of all, the existence of fossils, indicating organisms and species in different forms that we see today. Many species have gone extinct. Lots and lots of species have gone extinct. It's really quite amazing to think about how many species are in fact now extinct. Lots of examples of transitional forms. So here we see a variety of fossils that have been discovered that come from organisms that represent sort of a transition between animals that lived a purely aquatic existence versus ones that made a transition onto land and the origin of tetrapods. Vestigial traits that might perhaps still be found in descendants, but aren't necessarily used, or at least not used for the same thing that they were in the original ancestors. So there are a variety of vestigial traits that we can point to. So again, just a variety of things that represent sort of evidence that indeed species have changed over time. So in a general sense, how can we explain this change? How can we explain this descent with modification? Again, the basic ideas that Darwin proposed, these ideas related to evolution by natural selection. Again, keep in mind, natural selection is just one mechanism by which evolution can take place, but the basic tenets of natural selection are as follows. First of all, this idea that traits vary in populations. And you can see this, you just look at humans, for example. There's lots of variation in eye color, hair color, height, and so forth. So traits vary in population. We have to focus on those traits that are genetically based or that are heritable, not ones that might be acquired during an individual's lifetime. Right? So we're focusing on genetically based or heritable traits here. Out in nature, lots of factors come into play. Lots of competition for food, mates, various resources and so forth, dealing with diseases and predators and so forth. So lots of factors come into play. So the basic idea is that when you think about populations out in nature, obviously not all individuals survive, and not all individuals survive even long enough to produce offspring. Right? So those selective pressures are going to have a bearing on which organisms survive and pass on their alleles to future generations. So this basic idea, somehow some form of selection occurs, right? And based on combination of various physical traits, some organisms are going to be more fit than others, meaning they're going to be more likely to survive and be able to pass on their genes to their offspring. So these are the basic tenets of natural selection. Again, there's obviously a lot more to it than this, and more examples of evolution beyond just natural selection, but those will be explored in other videos. So this concludes our brief discussion of evolution by natural selection.